The rain pounded against Diana Fullerton's face like 1,000 tiny daggers. As she pounded her fists against the door of the home she had shared with her husband for 5 miserable years. Lightning cracked across the Montana sky, illuminating her drenched form for a brief, terrible moment as thunder crashed overhead, drowning out her desperate pleas. "Herbert, please, I'm sorry, let me in," she screamed, her throat raw from shouting against the howling wind. "I didn't mean what I said." But the door remained firmly shut, just as it had for the past hour as the storm had worsened from a light drizzle to this raging tempest. Diana's thin cotton dress clung to her shivering form, offering no protection against the biting wind of the October night. Her long blonde hair hung in wet ropes down her back, and her fingers were numb from cold and from beating against the unyielding wood. It had started with such a small thing, an overcooked roast. Herbert's temper had flared as it often did, but tonight, Diana had finally found her voice and spoken back. 5 years of silent suffering had burst forth in a torrent of words she could no longer contain. She had told him she was unhappy, that she regretted marrying him, that his father had been right about him being a failure. The moment the words had left her lips, she knew she had crossed a line. His face had transformed from red anger to cold fury. Without a word, he had grabbed her by the arm, dragged her to the door, and pushed her out into the beginning rainfall. The lock had clicked with terrible finality. "You can come back when you learn some respect," he had shouted through the door. "Until then, enjoy the weather." Diana had not believed he meant it, not as the rain began to fall harder, not as lightning began to dance across the darkening sky, not as the temperatures dropped with the setting sun. But an hour had passed, and still the door remained locked. Another flash of lightning revealed the empty road leading away from their isolated ranch house. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. In this weather, walking that far could mean death, especially in her thin dress and worn-out shoes. But staying out in the storm wasn't much better. With a sob of desperation, Diana turned from the door and staggered toward the barn. At least there, she might find some shelter from the rain, even if the wind would still cut through the cracks in the wooden walls. She stumbled across the muddy yard, the hem of her dress dragging in the muck, her shoes slipping on the wet ground. The barn door was heavy, but Diana managed to heave it open just enough to slip inside. The relative quiet was immediate, though the rain still hammered on the roof with deafening persistence. The familiar smell of hay and horses greeted her as she moved farther into the darkness. "Who's there?" a deep voice called, and Diana froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A match struck, and suddenly, a small flame illuminated a rugged face she had never seen before. A man sat up from a pile of hay, his tall frame unfolding as he stood and lit a nearby lantern, casting the barn in a warm glow. He was dressed in the unmistakable garb of a cowboy, dusty denim, worn leather boots, a faded bandana around his neck. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges beneath a well-used hat that he removed as he studied her dripping form. The most striking thing about him, though, were his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to catch the lamplight and reflect it back with intensity. "Madam," he questioned, his voice gentler now, "you're soaked through." Diana's teeth chattered too hard for her to respond immediately. She wrapped her arms around herself, painfully aware of how her wet dress clung to her body, leaving little to the imagination. I'm sorry," she finally managed. "I didn't know anyone was in here." The stranger frowned, taking a step toward her. "What are you doing out in this storm?" "It's no night for anyone to be outside, least of all a lady." Diana felt tears welling up again, mixing with the rainwater still streaming down her face. The kindness in the stranger's voice was nearly her undoing after Herbert's cruelty. "My husband," she began, then stopped, shame burning through her despite the cold. How could she admit to this stranger that her own husband had locked her out like an unwanted animal? The cowboy's expression darkened as understanding dawned. His gaze flicked toward the house, visible through a crack in the barn door when lightning flashed. Your husband locked you out, he stated, not a question but a certainty. Deanna nodded miserably, unable to meet his eyes. I'm Flynn Miller, he said, shrugging out of his heavy coat. I've been hired to help drive cattle north to Fort Benton come morning. He approached her slowly, as one might a frightened horse, and draped the coat around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, was almost painful against her chilled skin. Deanna Fullerton, she whispered, clutching the edges of the coat together. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Flynn nodded, then turned to his saddle bag nearby, pulling out a worn but clean shirt and pair of socks. You'll catch your death in those wet clothes, Mrs. Fullerton. I'll turn my back. Please, change into these. Deanna hesitated, but another violent shiver decided for her. She waited until Flynn had turned away, then peeled off her soaked dress with trembling fingers. The relief of dry fabric against her skin was indescribable as she slipped his shirt over her head. It hung to her knees like a dress itself, smelling of leather, tobacco, and something distinctly male that was not unpleasant. I'm decent, she said softly. Flynn turned, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the sight of her in his clothing, though she caught the briefest flash of something else in his eyes. He nodded toward a pile of hay. Sit down there by the lantern. I'll make some coffee to warm you up. As Deanna watched, Flynn efficiently set up a small camp stove he pulled from his pack, a luxury for a working cowboy that spoke of a man who valued what small comforts he could manage on the trail. Soon, the rich aroma of coffee filled the barn, almost masking the smell of rain and horses. How long have you been married, Mrs. Fullerton? Flynn asked as he handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. Deanna wrapped her fingers around the warm metal, savoring the heat. 5 years, she answered. Herbert brought me out here from Chicago in '76, right after we married. He had inherited this land from an uncle and promised me a life of adventure. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. And has it been an adventure? Flynn settled beside her, though he maintained a respectful distance. Deanna laughed, a hollow sound. If by adventure you mean isolation, endless work, and a husband who? She trailed off, taking a sip of coffee instead of finishing her thought. Flynn's eyes narrowed. Does he make a habit of this, locking you out? Deanna shook her head. No, this is the first time, but... She hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth from this stranger she would likely never see again after tonight. He's not a kind man, not like he pretended to be when we courted. Flynn was silent for a long moment, the only sound the rain hammering on the roof and the occasional whinny from the horses in their stalls. No man worth his salt would leave a woman out in weather like this, no matter what words were exchanged, he finally said, his voice low and tight with controlled anger. Deanna studied him over the rim of her cup. In the lantern light, she could see a thin scar running along his jawline, and the weathered quality to his skin that spoke of years under the sun. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way Herbert had been when she'd met him with his smooth skin and fashionable clothes, but there was something compelling about Flynn Miller's rugged features. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. You don't know me. Flynn's mouth quirked up in a half-smile. My ma raised me better than to leave a lady in distress. Besides, he added, his voice dropping lower, you'll sleep warm tonight, I promise you that. Deanna felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words, though she knew he meant nothing improper by them. Still, the quiet assurance in his voice stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. The storm showed no signs of abating as the night wore on. Flynn built up a small nest of hay and blankets for Deanna, insisting she take his bedroll while he made do with his saddle as a pillow. The coffee had warmed her from the inside, and his coat and shirt protected her from the worst of the chill. But Deanna still trembled occasionally as the wind found its way through the cracks in the barn walls. How long have you been a cowboy, Mr. Miller? She asked, wanting to fill the silence with something other than the sounds of the storm. Flynn lay on his back, staring up at the rafters. Since I was 16. That's 12 years now. Started on a small outfit in Texas, worked my way north over the years. Do you have family somewhere? A shadow passed over his face. Had a ma and pa and two sisters back in Kansas. Farm went under during a drought in '71. Pa died trying to save it. Ma followed a year later. Grief, the doctor said, but I think it was a broken heart. My sisters both married local boys. I write to them when I can. I'm sorry, Deanna said softly. Flynn shrugged. Life out here's hard on everyone. You find your way or you don't. He turned his head to look at her. What about you? Family back in Chicago? Deanna shook her head. My parents died in the fire of '71. I was working as a seamstress when I met Herbert. He seemed like a chance at something better. She gave a bitter laugh. I was naive. You were hopeful, Flynn corrected gently. There's no shame in that. Outside, thunder crashed so loudly the barn walls seemed to shake. Deanna jumped, a small sound of fear escaping her lips before she could stop it. Flynn was beside her in an instant, his hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching. It's all right, he assured her. This barn stood through worse storms. Deanna nodded, but couldn't help flinching when another bolt of lightning illuminated the interior of the barn through the gaps in the wood. Flynn hesitated, then put his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was both comforting and hesitant, as if he expected her to pull away. Instead, Deanna found herself leaning into his warmth, the solid strength of him a balm to her frayed nerves. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm not usually so frightened. No apologies needed, Flynn murmured, his breath warm against her hair. Storms like this would make anyone nervous. They stayed that way for several minutes, the propriety of their position far from Deanna's mind as she soaked in the comfort of human contact that wasn't tinged with anger or resentment. When was the last time Herbert had held her like this, simply to offer comfort? She couldn't remember. As her trembling subsided, Deanna became acutely aware of Flynn's heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and strong. She pulled away slowly, reluctantly, meeting his eyes in the dim light. The intensity she found there made her breath catch. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. Flynn nodded, his hand lingering on her shoulder for a moment before he withdrew it. You should try to get some sleep, Mrs. Fullerton. Morning will come soon enough. Deanna laid down, pulling his coat tighter around her. Deanna, she said quietly, please call me Deanna. A small smile played at the corners of Flynn's mouth. Good night, Deanna. Good night, Flynn. Despite the storm and the uncertainty of what morning would bring, Deanna fell asleep faster than she had in years, lulled by the steady presence of the man who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her husband had in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cracks in the barn walls and the realization that the storm had passed. Flynn was already up, tending to his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. He turned when he heard her stir. Morning, he said, his voice carrying across the barn. Storm broke just before dawn. Coffee's hot if you want some. Deanna sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. Thank you. As she sipped the strong brew, Deanna tried not to think about what awaited her in the house. Herbert would be sober by now, perhaps regretful, perhaps still angry. Either way, she would face his temper, his cruel words, his controlling ways. The thought made her stomach clench. What will you do now? Flynn asked, as if reading her thoughts. He sat beside her, his own cup in hand. Deanna stared into the dark liquid. Go back, I suppose. It's my home. Flynn's jaw tightened. Is it? A home should be a refuge, not a prison. I have nowhere else to go, Deanna said softly. No money of my own, no family. Flynn was silent for a long moment. I could take you to Fort Benton, he finally said. It's a week's ride, but there's work there for a woman who can sew. You mentioned you were a seamstress. Deanna looked up at him, startled. You would do that for me. A stranger, Flynn's eyes held her steadily. You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Deanna. The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. For a wild moment, Deanna imagined saying yes, climbing onto his horse behind him, and riding away from this place that had slowly killed her spirit over 5 long years. But reality intruded. Herbert would come after me. He wouldn't let me go so easily. Let me worry about Herbert, Flynn said, a hardness entering his voice. As if summoned by his name, the barn door swung open and Herbert Fullerton stood framed in the doorway, his face a mask of fury as he took in the sight of his wife in another man's clothing, sitting too close to a stranger. "So this is where you've been," Herbert spat, his eyes narrowed to slits. "Whoring yourself out to the first drifter who came along." Deanna flinched at the word, but Flynn was on his feet in an instant, stepping in front of her. "Watch your mouth," Flynn warned, his voice deadly quiet. "Your wife nearly froze to death because of you." Herbert sneered, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. He was a large man, taller than Flynn and heavier, with a mean streak that the whole county knew about but politely ignored. "This is my property, Cowboy, that's my wife. And I'm telling you to get on your horse and ride out before I decide to shoot you for trespassing." Flynn didn't move. "Deanna," he said without turning around, "is that what you want, for me to leave?" Herbert's face purpled. "Her name is Mrs. Fullerton to you, and what she wants doesn't matter." "She's my wife." Deanna stood slowly, her heart pounding. In the light of day, with Flynn standing before her like a shield, she found a courage she hadn't known she possessed. "No, Flynn," she said clearly, "that's not what I want." Herbert's hand moved to his gun, but Flynn was faster. In one smooth motion, he drew his revolver and aimed it at Herbert's chest. "I don't want trouble," Flynn said evenly, "but I won't let you harm her." Herbert's hand froze over his weapon. "You're making a mistake, mister. The law's on my side." "Maybe," Flynn acknowledged. "But right now, the gun is on mine. Deanna, get your things." Deanna hesitated only a moment before gathering up her now dry dress from where she'd hung it the night before. "You're not going anywhere with him," Herbert growled at her. "You're my wife." Deanna straightened, looking her husband in the eye. "You locked me out in a storm, Herbert, left me to die for speaking my mind. What kind of husband does that?" Herbert's expression wavered between anger and a flicker of something that might have been shame. "I was drunk." "I didn't mean for you to stay out all night." "But you did it anyway," Deanna said, "and it's not the first cruel thing you've done, just the worst." Flynn kept his gun trained on Herbert. "Here's what's going to happen," he said calmly. "Deanna is going to decide what she wants to do. If she wants to stay with you, I'll ride out and you'll never see me again. If she wants to leave, you're going to let her go with whatever belongs to her and you're not going to follow." Herbert's laugh was ugly. "Or what, Cowboy, you'll shoot me, then you'll hang." "I'd rather not shoot you," Flynn said, "but I will if I have to." The tension in the barn was thick enough to cut with a knife as Deanna looked between the two men. Herbert, who had promised her the world and delivered only isolation and cruelty. Flynn, a stranger who had shown her more kindness in one night than her husband had in years. In that moment, the choice seemed both impossible and incredibly simple. "I'm leaving, Herbert," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll take my mother's jewelry and my clothes, nothing else." Herbert's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "Both of you." Flynn's grip on his revolver didn't waver. "Deanna, go to the house and pack your things. Be quick." Deanna slipped past Herbert, who made no move to stop her, though his eyes promised retribution. She ran to the house, her heart racing, and quickly gathered her few precious possessions, the small box containing her mother's cameo and wedding ring, a handful of dresses, her winter coat, and the money she had carefully hidden beneath a loose floorboard over the years, saving a little each time Herbert sold cattle or crops. When she returned to the barn, the standoff continued, both men exactly as she had left them. Flynn's eyes flicked to her briefly. "Got everything?" Deanna nodded, clutching her small bundle. "Good. Now, Mr. Fullerton, we'll be on our way. I suggest you stay right where you are until we're out of sight." Herbert's hand tightened on his gun. "This isn't over." "For your sake, I hope it is," Flynn replied, backing toward his horse while keeping his weapon trained on Herbert. Deanna moved to the horse as well, her heart in her throat. Flynn helped her up into the saddle one-handed, then swung up behind her in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. His arm came around her waist, holding her securely as he turned the horse toward the open barn door. "If you follow us," Flynn said to Herbert, "you won't like what happens." With that, he urged the horse forward, and they rode out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving Herbert Fullerton standing in the barn doorway, his face dark with fury. Diana could scarcely believe what was happening as the horse galloped away from the only home she had known for 5 years. Flynn held her firmly against him, his body solid and warm at her back. The land stretched before them, vast and open, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure. "Are you all right?" Flynn asked, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the pounding of hooves. Diana nodded, not trusting her voice. She felt a complex mixture of terror, exhilaration, and something dangerously close to hope. They rode hard for several hours, stopping only when the horse needed rest. Flynn kept glancing behind them, but there was no sign of pursuit. By midday, they had reached a small creek where they paused to water the horse and rest. Diana sat on a fallen log, reality beginning to sink in. "What have I done?" she whispered, more to herself than to Flynn. Flynn crouched beside her, his expression concerned. "You've taken back your life," he said gently. "That takes courage." Diana looked up at him, searching his face. "Why are you doing this, risking yourself for me?" Flynn was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the water flowing past them. "When I was 16, he finally said, "I watched a man beat his wife half to death in a small town in Texas. Nobody did anything to stop it, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not me." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I swore I'd never stand by again if I could help." "Is that the only reason?" Diana asked, her voice barely audible. Flynn's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "No," he admitted, "that's not the only reason." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither was ready to name. Flynn stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "We should keep moving," he said. "Fort Benton is still a long way off." As they continued their journey, Diana learned more about Flynn Miller. He had been a cowboy for most of his adult life, drifting from job to job across the Western Territories. He was well respected for his skill with horses and his steady nature. He could read and write better than most men in his profession, thanks to his mother's insistence on education. He carried a battered copy of the Odyssey in his saddlebag, reading a few pages each night by firelight. In turn, Diana told him about her childhood in Chicago, her dreams of one day owning her own dress shop, and how those dreams had been set aside when Herbert had promised her adventure and prosperity in Montana Territory. She spoke of her loneliness, of the gradual erosion of her spirit under Herbert's control. They spent their nights beneath the stars, Flynn always maintaining a respectful distance, though Diana found herself wishing he wouldn't. There was something about this quiet, honorable cowboy that called to her in a way Herbert never had. His consideration, his gentle strength, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, all of it drew her to him like a moth to flame. On the third night, as they sat by a small campfire, Flynn finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "What will you do when we reach Fort Benton?" Diana stared into the flames. "Find work, I suppose, save money, make a new life." Flynn nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's a rough town, but there are good people there. I know a widow who runs a boarding house for respectable women. She'd give you a fair deal on a room." "And you?" Diana asked, looking up at him. "What will you do once you've delivered your cattle?" Flynn was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," he finally said. "I've been drifting for 12 years now, might be time to put down some roots." Diana's heart quickened. In Fort Benton, Flynn's eyes met hers across the fire. Maybe if there was a reason to stay. The air between them hummed with unspoken possibilities. Diana took a deep breath. Flynn, a crack of a twig in the darkness interrupted her. Flynn was on his feet in an instant, his gun drawn. "Get behind me," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Diana did as she was told, her heart racing. Had Herbert followed them after all? Had he hired men to track them down? "Show yourself," Flynn called out. "Don't shoot, mister." A voice called back, "Just a couple of travelers, same as you." Two men emerged from the darkness, their hands raised to show they were unarmed. They looked trail-worn but not threatening, a middle-aged man and a younger one who bore enough resemblance to be his son. "Evening," the older man said, nodding respectfully to Deanna. "Name's Thomas Jenkins. This is my boy, Samuel. We're headed to Fort Benton with a load of supplies. Saw your fire and thought we'd ask to share it if you're amenable." Flynn lowered his gun slightly but remained wary. Flynn Miller. "This is Deanna Fullerton." He deliberately omitted any mention of their relationship, letting the strangers draw their own conclusions. Thomas Jenkins seemed to take stock of the situation, a man and woman traveling alone, no wedding rings visible. His expression remained carefully neutral. "We've got some fresh coffee beans we'd be happy to share," he offered. "And my boy hunted a rabbit earlier, more than enough for 4. Flynn glanced at Deanna, who gave him a small nod. Having additional travelers might actually be safer, especially if Herbert was pursuing them. "All right," Flynn agreed. "You're welcome to share our fire." The addition of the Jenkins men changed the dynamic of their journey. The older man was a trader who made regular trips between Helena and Fort Benton, carrying goods in both directions. He was full of stories about the territories, and his son, though quieter, had a dry wit that often made Deanna laugh. More importantly, they provided a buffer between Deanna and Flynn, giving her time to think about what she truly wanted. The intensity of their connection had frightened her a little so soon after leaving Herbert. Was she simply latching onto the first kind man she encountered? Yet each time Flynn helped her onto his horse, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary, or when their eyes met across the campfire, Deanna felt something that had never existed with Herbert, a spark, a recognition, as if some part of her soul had been waiting for this man all along. On their 6th day of travel, Fort Benton appeared on the horizon, a sprawling collection of buildings alongside the Missouri River. Deanna felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Would this be where she and Flynn parted ways? As they rode into town, Thomas Jenkins gave them directions to the boarding house he had mentioned, run by the widow Mrs. Alina Davis. The main street was busy with traders, riverboat men, and the usual assortment of characters that populated frontier towns. Deanna attracted more than a few curious glances, women being somewhat scarce in such places. Flynn helped Deanna down from the horse in front of a neat 2-story building with a small sign identifying it as Davis Boarding House, respectable accommodations for ladies. "I'll see about getting you settled," Flynn said, his voice oddly formal after days of growing closeness. "Then I need to meet the cattle drive coming in from the north." Deanna nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, Mrs." Davis turned out to be a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with kind eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Deanna and Flynn and seemed to understand the situation without being told. "Rooms $5 a week, meals included," she informed Deanna. "No men above the first floor, no exceptions. I can help you find work if you're looking. Several shops in town need seamstresses." "Thank you," Deanna said gratefully. "That would be very helpful." Flynn paid for 2 weeks in advance, despite Deanna's protests that she could use her own money. "Consider it a loan," he insisted. "You can pay me back when you're settled." Mrs. Davis showed Deanna to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, then tactfully left her alone with Flynn for a moment to say their goodbyes. An awkward silence fell between them. "Thank you," Deanna finally said, the words wholly inadequate for all he had done. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Flynn shook his head. "No need for repayment, I'm just glad you're safe. Will I see you again?" Deanna asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but needing to know. Flynn took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of leather and tobacco that she had come to associate with him. "If you want to," he said quietly. "I do," Deanna whispered. Flynn's hand came up to gently touch her cheek, and Deanna leaned into the contact, her eyes closing briefly. "I'll be back in 3 days," he promised. "The cattle drive will take that long to settle." Deanna nodded, trying to ignore the irrational fear that once he left, she would never see him again. As if reading her mind, Flynn bent down and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. 3 days, he repeated. "I promise." True to his word, Flynn returned exactly 3 days later. Deanna had already found work at a dress shop owned by a friendly woman named Mrs. Green, who had been delighted to discover Deanna's skill with a needle. The pay wasn't much, but combined with the money she had brought with her, it would be enough to support herself once the 2 weeks at the boarding house were up. Flynn took Deanna to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest establishment in Fort Benton. Over a meal far better than the trail food they had grown accustomed to, Flynn shared his plans. "I've bought some land," he announced, watching her face carefully. 20 acres just outside of town. There's a small cabin already built, needs some work, but it's solid, good grazing land." Deanna's heart quickened. "You're staying in Fort Benton?" Flynn nodded. "I'm tired of drifting, want to raise horses, maybe some cattle, build something that lasts." He hesitated, then reached across the table to take her hand. "Deanna, I know it's too soon. You've just gotten free of one man, and the last thing you need is another making claims on you. But I want you to know that my feelings for you are real and they're not going away." Deanna felt tears prick at her eyes. "Flynn, you don't have to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Deanna squeezed his hand, unable to find the words for the emotions welling up inside her. Instead, she simply nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. The next few months passed in a blur of hard work and new beginnings. Deanna established herself as the finest seamstress in Fort Benton, eventually saving enough to rent a small shop of her own. Flynn worked tirelessly on his land, building fences, repairing the cabin, acquiring horses. They saw each other regularly: dinners, Sunday afternoons, occasional rides out to Flynn's property to check on his progress. Herbert never came after Deanna, though she lived in fear of it for the first few months. They later learned from a trader passing through that Herbert Fullerton had sold his ranch and moved back east, his pride too wounded to remain in a place where everyone knew his wife had left him. As winter gave way to spring, Deanna's feelings for Flynn deepened from gratitude to friendship to something much more profound. His patience, his unwavering support of her independence, his quiet strength, all of it made her realize what love was supposed to be. On a warm evening in May, nearly 6 months after that stormy night when Flynn had found her shivering in a barn, Deanna rode out to his property at his invitation. He had been mysterious about the reason, saying only that he had something to show her. The cabin had been transformed. What had once been a simple one-room structure was now an expanded, comfortable home with a proper bedroom, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, and a small parlor with bookshelves already filled with volumes. Curtains hung at the windows, and a handmade quilt adorned the bed. "Flynn, it's beautiful," Deanna breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. Flynn watched her, his eyes full of hope. "There's one more thing," he said, leading her outside and around to the back of the cabin. There, attached to the main structure, was a small room with large windows to let in natural light. Inside was a sewing table, shelves for fabric and notions, and a dress form. "I thought, if you wanted, you could work from home sometimes," Flynn explained, suddenly seeming uncertain. "I know how important your independence is to you and your shop in town. This wouldn't replace that. It would just be for when you wanted to be here. With me." Deanna stared at the room, understanding the question he was really asking. She turned to face him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Are you asking me to marry you, Flynn Miller?" she whispered. Flynn took her hands in his. "I'm asking if you'll share my life, Deanna Fullerton, as my wife, my partner, my equal. I love you, your strength, your courage, your gentle heart. I want to build a future with you if you'll have me." Deanna looked into his eyes, remembering that night in the storm when a stranger had promised her she would sleep warm and had kept that promise in more ways than he could have known. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Flynn's smile was brighter than the Montana sun as he pulled her into his arms. When their lips finally met in their first kiss, Deanna knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last. 1 year to the day after Flynn had found Deanna shivering in that barn, they stood before a preacher in Fort Benton and exchanged vows. Deanna wore a dress she had made herself, white with delicate embroidery. Flynn wore a new suit, looking somewhat uncomfortable but impossibly handsome, Mrs. Davis cried openly, having become something of a mother figure to Deanna. Thomas and Samuel Jenkins attended as well, the older man insisting on giving the bride away. As they spoke their promises to one another, Deanna thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. A storm, a locked door, a cowboy with kind eyes, and a strong sense of justice all had conspired to give her a second chance at happiness. Later that night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Deanna's head resting on Flynn's chest, she reflected on how far she had come from that terrified, shivering woman. "What are you thinking about?" Flynn asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That night in the storm," Deanna admitted. "When you told me I would sleep warm tonight," Flynn chuckled, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. "I meant it then, but I didn't know just how much I would come to mean it." Deanna propped herself up on one elbow, gazing down at the face of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I love you, Flynn Miller." Flynn pulled her down for a kiss. "And I love you, Deanna Miller, now and for all the days to come." Outside, a spring rain began to fall, pattering gently on the roof of their home. But inside, all was warmth and love and the promise of a future built together, one day at a time.